Welcome to another episode of Adventures of a Serial Entrepreneur. This time we're going to cover three main topics. The first one is the importance of considering runway in your business, and we'll explain very shortly what that means. The other subject is really important, I feel, and it's very close to my heart. I feel that's one of the biggest things that have helped, I believe, in many of your businesses, and it's the importance of using such things as white labeling or subcontracting or strategic alliances to catapult the business, especially at the beginnings. And the third point is the importance of having some level of legal knowledge and legal understanding and not completely leaving everything to lawyers. And we'll give a few examples of how that helped Rick through his journey. You ready to go?
So I'm doing all the talking again.
You're doing all the talking again.
Okay.
But, I'll have my time.
All right. Well, good luck with that. Within the few minutes that we have.
I'll try.
I think we're kicking off from where we left off last time. Is that right? So that was
That's right, yeah. So last time...
1986 or something.
Something like that. And the last time we were talking about you were having worked at Cockatoo Dockyard.
Oh, yes.
With the engineering degree at the same time and a job and 2 jobs and a business and like 50 million things at the same time and 0 sleep hours and
I remember. It'll all be on Wikipedia for everyone to read any moment now. Supposedly someone's putting all this stuff up. So I was in two minds between if I was going to be an engineer or if I was going to be the big entrepreneur, and I really didn't know which way I was going to go. So I went to my senior manager at the time and I asked him for a promotion, thinking that, really this is the thing I'm going to fall back on.
That's at Cockatoo Dockyard.
Yeah. And I was in the mechanical drawing office at the time, and 86 was a year of firsts. It was probably the big fundamental year of change for me, going from essentially what ultimately was a side hustle into, and that's one of the lessons I think for today is to, at least for me, on how I did things, noting that everything that we talk about is how we did things, and there's lessons to be learned in all of those things, but that's not to say that the way that we did them is the right way for anyone else to do them.
And look, as it stands, there are quite often several right ways to do things. We're just telling you from our experience what's worked for us. And that's where...
I'm the master of blunders, so hopefully now, and when we finally get around to talking about, stuff in the current modern digital age where everyone's got a Lamborghini and, an 8-star home living by the water, and they're all rich apparently, we'll start talking about how to do things right. Not so. Anyway, I got knocked back for a promotion. The less you knew, the higher up the hierarchy you went back then. Needless to say that a year later they started to go broke. And I at that point, that they made my decision fairly swift and simple to flick the switch. Now this is in my essentially second to third year of running a side hustle. And this is a business now that's making so much more money than I was making earning a full-time wage. And it had been doubling every year from the first year. So at this point, I'm probably sitting on around $160,000, and my income from being an engineer was sitting on around about, 30,000, something like this. So I'm making so much more. And that's on the top though. So that's not, comparing apples with apples as to what's on the bottom. I'm talking revenue versus actual net profit or cash in the bank, etc. And I wasn't drawing a wage from that. In fact, the money I was making from my full-time job was all going back into the business to finance the growth. When you mentioned Runway, Runway takes on many different forms in terms of explanation, and I'll come to that talking about Runway on a couple of different fronts. But in one of those, let's call it example number 1, is in relation to when to flick the switch. How much money do I need to have in my emergency fund or my sinking fund or my slush fund, call it whatever you like, before I can get rid of the security of that full-time income? And so that's runway number 1.
So what you're saying is, Rick, there's really that gap between when you start a new business or when you're even changing direction in a business, and I can give you examples on that as well, where we ended up having this runway problem.
Well, this is not so much starting a new business. I've already been in business for 2 or 3 years. Well, this is my technically at the end of my second year.
Right, but it's at a point where you can't quite lose the day job, or you may be able to, but there is a degree of uncertainty in where the new business is heading, and if you stop making the income that you're making from the day job, that's going to put a major hindrance on the current business because it's growing, you're reinvesting into it. So there's that period of time. Typically, runway is referred to as that period of time when the business is losing money or is having a great deal of cash flow, negative cash flow, or not at a point where it can sustain itself, including the person that's at the top of the food chain.
That's one way to explain runway, but runway means many things to different people. In this context, we're talking about runway in terms of not having the security of that income being injected. How long can I go with no longer having that income injected? But it's a double whammy because the business is growing, and I'll talk about that later, is how do you finance growth? It's one of the greatest mysteries of entrepreneurship failure or startup failure, where people don't take into account the funding of growth. And it usually gets left out of the equation. So people are so keen or eager to flick the switch. I can't tell you the number of entrepreneurs that I've spoken to that have said to me on hindsight, after they've heard me explain this, geez, I jumped the gun and I flicked the switch too early. Now I'm in trouble. Now I've got to basically slow down the growth of my startup and go back and get a job, and it's like starting all over again. Sure, I've got some IP, got some ideas, got some sales here and there, but it's just not the same. So they helped speed it up. I had very good cash flow, but I was growing so quickly, so it was a concern. And what made it worse was that at that point in time, we picked up a number of new contracts. The work was going off the dial. And something happened with my dad, and I made a decision to put to him the idea that he come on board as well. So now we've got a business before that did have a couple of full-time staff, but I was funding it with my engineering income. That's gone. Now I'm full-time. Now my dad's full-time. All of a sudden we've got a business with 4 full-time staff, and it's heading towards 160 to 320, doubling in growth in terms of revenue. And put that in perspective, the year after that, it went to 760,000. So it more than doubled after, you think 640, 320 times 2, right? So that's one big thing that you've got to be very careful of. Most people, or a lot of people go broke during that process. They don't factor that in when they flick the switch. Here I just finished writing this humongous, in fact, I've got a copy of it right here, this humongous big fat book. I was going to be, I kept on saying, I've got to have something to fall back on. I'm going to be the big engineer. I wrote this thing about wear-resistant coatings for machining applications. I was at the government institution in a place called Linfield in Sydney. I was there sometimes till 5 o'clock in the morning. I was there for a year, basically there and at Tokatoo Dockyard and running the business and at university. It was insanity. So 100-hour plus weeks.
You're referring to your thesis that you had to do it in the last year.
Yeah, but I didn't just do it any old way because I really had it in the back of my mind. It was always there that, I am going to be the big engineer and I'm going to go on and do the PhD, blah, blah, blah. And in the end, when I flicked the switch, it was excruciating to continue to go to university because here I am wanting to make all this money. I was making as much money in one night as I'm making in a whole week being an engineer. And so I'm sitting there in a lecture thinking I could be out there making $500 tonight, and here I am spending $500. Anyway, cut a long story short, this will happen to a lot of people I speak to where they get caught up in this mess, if you will, of not knowing when to make that decision. So anyway, another point that you raised was in relation to, did you say white labeling?
I did say white labeling,
Okay.
subcontracting. I mean, there's many ways of looking at it, really.
Okay, so one of the big subjects that helped this growth, if you will, was having, I would call it a joint venture partner, beyond just simply an affiliate, whereby, and the way it worked in that industry was the client would book the hotel would book the catering and all these different things, including the entertainment, through an agent, and then the agent would then farm out the work to the relevant contractors, and that could include a company that took care of a particular style of entertainment, which we did. But it went through to one fellow, and he kept booking us for more and more work, to the point where, in the end, we were essentially his only customer. So one of the philosophies that we engaged in the business, what's that?
You mean supplier?
He was the supplier to them, but we were the supplier to him.
Right.
And so he became the middleman. And we had two very important, unique value propositions. One of those was, as far as he's concerned, was we wouldn't say no to any booking. We always provided a premium service, which I'll talk about also in a moment, in relation to developing a very unique, consistent compliance style of service, if you will.
So I just wanted to raise that point and just make sure we understand what happened at that time, when at one point in time he starts booking you to do the DJ work, and you had your own subcontractors and all that. Yeah. And then somewhere between that and some period of time, you became his only supplier.
Yeah, so
tell me what happened there to make that happen.
This happens in almost every industry. It happens in transport as an example of, it's a very good analogy. So let's say that agent would have had another regular that he was using, and he rings that particular person up to delegate or to allocate the work. And that person says no, so then he will come back to me. So he might have had 2 or 3 going with me, and each one of those are individuals. That person says no, I get the phone call, I say yes, I get the gig, testimonial gets shot off. Customer, the supplier, is very happy. Now, I've just made it so that he has to make 1 phone call less next time, and next time I get 4. And this was a process that I cottoned on to very early, and, if you like, extrapolated to the point where within 6 months, we were the only supplier to that supplier. So he became the middleman and nothing more but taking a clip. So the details would go from the primary agent to the supplier to us, and we took care of all the work. Now, a key word here is ethical. We were very, very ethical. We would never, ever go behind the middleman. Don't bite the hand that feeds, as they say. So this is white labeling. We are going out under his name, under his umbrella, as it were.
And the other point that I wanted to raise also is that this is, this is a strategy. Obviously, you mentioned that before, but the strategy of gaining business by convenience. It's just a simple strategy. But in many cases, as we all know, or as most of us know, is that people aren't always looking for the best price. But in so many cases, they're looking for good service and all that, and everyone says good service, great service, yeah. We all heard that before, but that's a perfect example of good service.
But having said that, service. The principle was against volume and scale. So it's a win-win-win. It's a win for the agent. It's a win for the hotel. It's a win for the middleman. It's a win for us. It's a win for the contractors with whom we subcontract. But here's the thing. I've got a middleman now who we've conditioned to be now, as another 6 months goes past, completely 100% dependent upon us. These other guys that were saying no willy-nilly have now gone on their merry way from time to time. He's no longer a regular supplier. So he's taking a clip that's impacting on our income, and volume will only take you so far eventually. So we entered into an arrangement, if you will, to buy him out. So I think you mentioned about having some fundamental understanding of legal practices or whatever.
Yes,
Did you mention that?
Yes, that's
Okay.
part of what we're
So
covering.
this was my first negotiating, if you will, to buy a situation. You could call it a business. I suppose it was my first A&M, acquisition and merger. And it was also my first situation where I was negotiating and representing myself directly against the other side, knowing that I had the power to frustrate the other side, knowing that the other side would be paying the lawyer and I'm not paying a lawyer. I'm bootstrapping everything. I just finished a course at uni on contracts, mind you, so that came in very handy. And so I ended up negotiating a contract, and I have a copy of that here too. It's very convenient. There it is. And it's only 4 pages long, right? Actually 3.5, because all the remaining pages is the schedule. And that schedule has every hotel in Sydney essentially written out there on 2 pages in the schedule, saying that he, as the vendor, is not allowed to supply any services to those particular hotels. So that's a caveat, right? Or depending on which country, caveat. So I ended up frustrating them, and his legal bills were going up and up and up, and ended up creating a contract which was 100% bulletproof and risk-free on my part. So if the work went down for any reason, remember this is incognito, the agent still didn't know what was going on here, right? Well, actually he did, but he was still involved.
Yeah.
Right? The middleman was still involved, and it was and you've got to do this very carefully whenever there's a change coming up in business with ownership or management. We call that, there's stuff about change management and all that. Whenever there's a big change like this, one has to be very, very careful. So ease it in very, very slowly. Same contractors, same entertainers. I'm the same guy. The middleman is now starting to be phased out. If the work went down, the repayments went down.
That's a pretty good deal for you.
So he was locked in. He had to make sure that this thing went ahead.
Yeah.
And I had 12 months to pay it off.
Right. I mean, the other thing here is, as you said, it's quite sensitive because really there aren't any exclusive arrangements in writing or anything that really can be relied on.
It's all goodwill.
With between him and the agents that were giving him the work in the first place. So really this was all just, very fine to tread around.
That's right.
But still, relationships did have value, and they still do. And you just kind of tiptoed around what was an established, business or goodwill relationship.
What happened was, because the middleman didn't have the vested enthusiasm or passion for the business anymore, he was just taking a clip.
Yeah.
He would. This now gave me a capacity, once the relationship with the agent direct between him and myself was on fire, that gave me the capacity to create influence and to expand the network. And so this had another nuclear impact on growing the business, because it wasn't just the bookings I was getting here. I was helping the agent together and collectively build a much bigger empire, if you will. So that was the beginning. That was another big first. Another one was we started doing installations, we started doing productions, we started doing deliveries. Yep.
I'll make the point about the legal subject that we mentioned before.
Oh, that will be a module all by
That's
itself.
a whole module in its own
An
right.
episode, yes.
I know. But you mentioned, I mean, we're kind of touching on the fact that we believe that every business owner, every entrepreneur really needs to have a good understanding of law. Not to the point of having studied law and be a lawyer themselves, but at least enough to be able to, negotiate, have a good understanding of what tools you have to negotiate, and also enough to be able to drive the lawyers. If you leave everything to the lawyers, God help you. Not to say that they're bad people or anything else like that, but it's just like so many other things. If you leave something completely of such magnitude of importance to someone else, whose interest is to jack up the price or to jack up the cost of the whole
They're called
equation.
work creationists.
Work creationists, then you really deserve what you get, unfortunately. Sorry. But again, to reiterate on another point here, is that you clearly understood the points where you had power in this negotiation. Every negotiation, there's power that you have.
You've got to be patient with that.
Right, exactly. There's some points where you have the power and other points where they have the power. You actually had a lot more power than they probably realized. I mean, they eventually knew that. But the power, aspects where you had power was the fact that you actually were doing all the work already. So you knew all the clients, you knew, if you had moved away from that relationship, that guy would be in big trouble.
Correct.
Or if you had jumped over his head, he still would have been in big trouble. So he knew that, although you're ethical and you did the right thing, but he would have known that. And the other point of power is, of course, the whole playing with time and playing with lawyers' time. So
Correct.
he's racking up these big bills.
Yep.
You're just spending your time negotiating, and that's a good level of power as well in its own right. And using that, you got what you wanted, essentially.
If you reverse this up, and we'll talk about this in later episodes, but if you leave everything to the accountants, the lawyers, the consultants, if you will, a lot of these guys, especially lawyers, they have to, by design, be obstructionists. Now, this is not the case in this situation because I'm buying. They don't want to obstruct. They want to do the opposite,
right,
from my point of view. But from the point of view of the vendor, he wants to protect the interests of the vendor. But the vendor now is saying to the lawyer, "Come on, let's get this done."
Yeah.
And in the end, they just said, because I'm speaking directly to the lawyer, which is another myth, by the way, if a lawyer says to you, "Oh, we don't deal with individuals. We only deal with lawyers. Who's acting for you?" Just be careful of that one, because if you know enough about, and you've got the power, contracts, for example, in this situation, then it might be, if it's a fairly simple scenario, which this ended up being, they made it complicated. They simplified it and dumbed it right down so that anyone could read this contract and understand it. Then why pay a lawyer? I mean, what the other whammy with all of this is that we've got to finance the fact is all of this stuff is done on terms, 30-day terms. So the more of this type of work we brought in, as opposed to casual work where you get a deposit and collect on the night, COD, we call that, cash on delivery, then you've got to be able to finance that as well. So you don't want to grow the 30-day term work too quickly when you're in this situation.
True, that makes sense. And the other thing about the lawyers also, I feel that, we owe the lawyers to say this. Is
we need them. We live with them, but we sort of can't.
We can't live with them, and we can't live without them.
Yeah.
But the thing that really matters as far as lawyers, and what you really need to suck out of your lawyer, is what are my risks? Where can things go wrong? What can we do to protect me from this? And then you can make your own decisions based on that. But at least they need to help you be able to make your own decisions by highlighting the sort of things. And in many cases, you can be the one that's going to highlight what can go wrong, especially if it's a,
I suggest we do a whole episode just on lawyers.
We've got a lot to say about that.
It's a bit beyond the scope to go into too much detail. I mean, one of the big problems with this business growing so quickly, and you'll have this problem potentially in your business, is, often you're getting booked. And with this agent, I was the number one push product. So whenever a new venue, like the Hilton Hotel may not have been booking them, for example, they would, Rick, you've got to go and do this gig on Saturday night because we're looking to pick the venue up. So I'd go out there and do the gig. I provided a premium service, not just because I was the owner. I was pretty good at the job, as most owners are, mind you. That's how it just works out. You would know that. Then next week, the hotel, they would ring up the agent and say, "Oh, that guy you sent out here on Saturday night was pretty good. Can we get him back?" Now the agent would say, "Yeah, sure." And of course, you can only be in one place at one time. So during this whole switchover between having a job and taking over this, this merger, if you will, negotiating all this, my dad coming on board, taking on, if you don't take on work just because it's available, that can bring you undone. You've got to put the brakes on. And so, I was sometimes working 120-hour weeks. So one of the things that I did was, which gave us a distinct, unique value proposition in the marketplace, and we were the only ones to do it. It was the first basically DJ and MC school in Australia, which then became a public speaking academy. And so what that did, by me creating a compliance manual, writing my first book called Career DJ, which I have a copy of around here somewhere. I can't hold it up for you. I can't see it. It was like 100 pages, created a curriculum, a syllabus, which I still use today on the public speaking side of things. And, very unique IP to be able to scale the business by obtaining people that weren't necessarily talented or skilled or, dare I say, qualified in the industry, and within a short space of time, turn them into people that were confident enough to go to their Hilton hotel and hold the microphone and MC a wedding, for example.
I mean, that's a great concept in its own right, and I've seen that work a number of times. Instead of taking people that already have developed bad habits and think they've got it figured out and think that this is the right way to do things, just bring in people with the right attitude, with the right competence level, and then just train them up.
That's it.
To do it the way you have seen work.
Often I got engineering students who were, like the mouse that roared, even nerdy type people. And by the time I was done with them, after 7 lessons, seriously, they were different people. And, it changed a lot of people's lives. And people even 10, 20 years later would ring me up and say, you completely transformed me and took me out of my shell. Another thing that we did, which was very unique it sort of goes with the whole not saying no, is to have a philosophy as part of the vision of a zero tolerance to mistakes. So I just mentioned about compliance manual. All the entertainers were trained in the same way. They all signed off on the mission and vision statements, blah blah blah, all that stuff, and they all had the same uniform, which was a black dinner suit with a bow tie, which had to be inspected. And the same went for the contractors on their equipment. So we had all these people on my equipment. And I was always in overflow. I always needed more people on their equipment because we couldn't build the stuff fast enough in using our own equipment. We always ran out of equipment. So we had a system whereby any information that was passed on to a contractor, as it was passed off on a worksheet, each detail. So, for example, we were the only company that said, okay, let's say it starts at 7 o'clock. We had to be set up ready to play by 6. So we always had an extra hour. It's none of this business of ready to play by 7. We always had lead time for everything. So we would, as per the camera, tick as the person in the office explained the information to the operator. We would tick it. So set up by 6, start at 7, finish at 12. And after 12 would be an overtime rate, whatever it might be. And then the contractor would be asked, in accordance with the terms of the contract, which will lead me into another subject in a moment in terms of my first audit, which was with the taxation office. The contract was tested, and I wrote the contract, which I still use today for contractors, would you believe, 34 years later. It is 2020 when we recorded this. And so as it was read back, it was crossed. So the tick went, whoop, that way, sorry, and across. And so if anything was left on the page not crossed, it means that either the person who was giving out the information in the office made a mistake or the contractor made a mistake. And you could pick it out visually straight away. Just a very, very simple checklist system, if you will. And that was built into the contract. So in the contract, there was like 40 different terms.
You mean that you have with your contractors?
Yeah, and it would say something like, and you agree to repeat any information given to you by the company, And so a simple thing like making the decision to have a zero a policy for how would you say, a zero tolerance to mistakes. The minute that you say that and it's in writing and it's signed off and it's gone back and forth through the motions, you'd be surprised how much money that's going to save you in terms of ramp up. If you're ramping up a business and growing, you cannot afford to be chasing your tail around, financing blunders, let alone being on the runway, financing growth in triple digits.
Okay, so tell us about this audit you talked about.
Well, I was audited in 1986 by the tax office, where I had a contractor working for me who happened to have a full-time wage. He was one of the full-time staff who was a part-time contractor. And his father was a high-profile accountant. And when it came tax time, the son didn't put the money aside from the tax to pay his tax from his contracting work. And the father blamed the company, which was me, for not withholding the tax before paying him. And anyway, he reported me to the tax office and risking his own son's job in the process, would you believe. But they shut me down for a week. They have what we call executive powers. They came in, they turned the answering machine on back in those days. And basically, I couldn't operate the business for a week while they went through and reconciled to make sure that the paperwork matched from the contractors, if you will, that they were contractors and that they were not employees against the check butt. So a little trick there is that, first of all, I know people don't use checks today, but whether it's digital, electronic, or otherwise, just make sure that the books are always in order and that they always reconcile with your payments. And if you are going to be supplying contractors equipment and there's a risk that they could possibly be deemed to be employees, and it won't save you because there's like 20 different tests, but this is one of them. They're essentially hiring the equipment from you to use as tools of trade for them to execute their services as a contractor. Just because you have a contract and you call them a contractor doesn't make them a contractor. It would be nice if we could have everyone be deemed as a contractor so it's less paperwork for us and more for them, right? But it doesn't work that way. So back at the ranch, I was audited by the tax office. They went away after a week. I rang them up the next week and said, look, could they put in writing to say that, the way I've been running my business is okay. I got no fines, no nothing. And they said, if you, cut a long story short, after like 10 phone calls, they said, if you ring us again and ask us to put anything in writing to say we even attended your premises, we're going to shut you down. So the lesson in that is just be very, very careful. And I had discussed my contract with lawyers. They all had different opinions. No one knew what exactly was right in terms of what would protect us in the event that something like this would come up. 9 years later, that contract continued to be in use with that business at the time when I sold it for a substantial profit. And that was $1 million business, by the way, at that point. So, I guess runway number 2 is financing growth. And you've got to factor all these other things in that we've been talking about. And so, again, for later episodes, we'll talk about lots of tricks and hints and tips about bootstrapping, how to bootstrap everything, every element of your business, hopefully. So my dad came in, we were there, the business was scaling, we had to increase the GP, we had to get more efficient, we had to reduce the cost of work, we had to scale the way in which we manufactured equipment. I think I'll be talking about that in later episodes. Then I ended up having to negotiate my first lease. That was another thing which I had to represent. Well, I did represent myself. Bear in mind, I'm bootstrapping, right? So I can't afford to go out giving, $500 an hour for every Tom, Dick, and Harry lawyer out there. But yeah, sure, I did end up using a lawyer to help sign off on some of those docs. And look, I think, if you were to sum up the points that you made in the beginning, I think I've responded to most of those points, have I?
I think we have. So
one more point about the IP I mentioned about public speaking and that with the school that I started. The big thing that's missing in most education is all around soft skills. And essentially, that's what I was teaching in that school. Sure, there were techniques, there were special idiosyncrasies related to that industry, as there is in any industry.
Right.
But the commonality with all industries is soft skills. So when I said the compliance manual and the contract and teaching them through the school and so forth, I'm teaching them how to shake people's hands. I'm teaching them how to meet and greet people. All of that is a thing which generally business school won't teach you. I don't think you can get that in any, normal standard education. That's right.
Normal.
So he who masters soft skills often is the one who is going to succeed the fastest and with the greatest semblance in terms of growing your business. So I hope that sort of gives you some feedback for those points.
Thank you for that, Rick. So, to summarize what we've talked about in this episode, we've talked about the importance of white labeling / subcontracting / strategic partnerships to get things moving fast. We've talked about the importance of having legal knowledge, just enough to get by at least, or to drive the lawyers. And of course, we've talked about Runway. I hope this has been useful to everyone, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.